snowman, one must have a mind of winter, to regard the frost in the boughs of the pine trees crusted with snow, and have been cold a long time, to behold the junipers shagged with ice, the spruces rough in the distant glitter of the January sun, and not to think of any misery in the sound of the wind, in the sound of a few leaves, which is the sound of the land, full of the same wind that is blowing in the same bare place, for the listener who listens in the snow, and, nothing himself, beholds nothing that is not there, and nothing that is. There you go. The Snowman by Wallace Stevens. What an epic poem that is. I'm Bruce McDonald, and this is the Talamanca Review. It's Saturday the 27th of September, and it's 10:30 p.m. on the nose. I got a number of different things on my mind tonight, and I've been heavily stimulated by a video that I watched. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Professor Hamamoto. A really good voice out there on deconstructing what's going on, and just another super smart Asian dude who can penetrate and decode and deconstruct this Abrahamic secret society, Kabbalistic bullshit society we live in, as well as anybody. And I don't mean to be racist by pointing out that he's Asian, that he's Japanese. It's just that I always imagined that understanding where we're coming from as a cultural psychology, as an aggregate or concatenated cosmology of shared consciousness that is Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. I've always felt that that would be very difficult to understand if you were born outside of it, because it is really one of the most bizarre religions on the planet, you know. And most every other society on the planet that has what we would call the attributes of civilization, which would be poetry, architecture, weapons manufacture, navies. And I mean, navies go back like 1,000 years if you want to throw the Vikings in, right? There's some people who are saying that the Chinese circumnavigated the globe centuries before the European explorers like Christopher Columbus, and they deemed the world unready to communicate with because it was too barbaric. But those are my markers for a civilization. So you've got architecture, which is, the building of interesting and mathematically sound structures, especially structures that go beyond one story. You see this in Chinese architecture and the brick making and the mortar and the large temple-like structures that go up 5, 6, 7 floors way before we invented high-rises or multi-level dwellings in the West. Japanese, same thing. You got the poetry, you got the literature, and you got a solid philosophical and spiritual base to form a collective consciousness, right? So you've got several levels of consciousness that are part of the entrainment of an individual. And the first one is your family, and that's both nature and nurture, which is the great sociological debate, right? Is it your environment that changes you, or determines you, or is it your genetics? And the family is the only thing that has both, because your parents control the environment you're raised in, and they also pass their genes to you. So you've got both there. And then there's the larger community you belong to. A couple podcasts ago, I talked about, you know, my mother, who's 87 now, growing up in a time where you could be beat up for going to a Protestant town if you were Catholic to buy milk or sugar because you didn't belong in the Protestant town because you were Catholic. This is what I mean by the cultural container. And everybody's got them. They, you know, Japan is a cultural container. Then within that cultural container, there are micro containers. There's a Tokyo culture. There's a Kyoto culture. There's an Osaka culture. Osaka is where karate comes from. And in Chinese, China, you have a number of microcultures and many, many different languages, home-spoken dialects, because the rigor of the communist system demands that everybody speak in the simplified Mandarin now, the four-tone Mandarin. So that's what they do. Now, I personally have always found the exploration and study of cultures to be absolutely fascinating. And at this stage in my life, the cultures that I find absolutely the most fascinating are rural and remote cultures. Both rural and remote. So, I mean, you can be rural and right off a highway with cars going by every day in a town 5-minute walk away where there's a grocery store and a bank and stuff like that. But so rural and remote. And I find that this kind of living, and I may be prejudiced because I've been living this way for 10 years now and I absolutely love it, but I find that this modality of living is the one that produces what I would call the most authentic people. Okay? And specifically because so much of their culture is drawn from nature. And nature is a natural spiritual instructor. Okay? Nature factors incredibly into the Shinto religion in Japan. There would be no Taoism without the natural world to study. Now, it goes multidimensional, but it begins with a profound meditation on nature. And then there's a completely different philosophical base in the East. They're not coming off the Greek philosophers. They're coming off of people like Confucius and Mencius, who are their great philosophers, who gave the Chinese cultures social order. Okay, we get our social order from the Greeks and the Hebrews because unlike the Eastern religions, the Hebrew religion is really the lawgiver. All of the laws in the West, especially post-Gutenberg, as we moved from a common law society to a mercantile society, and we started to write the laws of exchange and admiralty law, and then you come up to the 20th century and you get an entirely statutory person and laws governing that statutory person based on centralized banking, social programs, a birth certificate, and a social insurance number. And all of this comes from the original Roman and Hebrew law because the Romans had a lot of civil law as well. And for those of you who've ever studied law, I mean, even as a layperson, you can study law. I went through a few years in Canada where I used to study law all the time. And just read statutes and acts. So I actually just had a little power outage there. And so I probably could have just continued recording and stitched the two files together, the first 10 minutes and whatever follows from here. But it's kind of weird when the power goes out up here because everything goes pitch black. Right? I mean, you man, you've never seen pitch black until you've been up in the rainforest and the electricity goes out, man. I mean, it's as black gets. And once again, because I rebooted the computer, I have to do my... No, the sound seems okay there, yeah. I don't have to do my sound again. So I was talking about, Roman civil law and all of these sorts of things, but... And then I always find it amazing when outsiders can penetrate a culture and express it. I remember one time, this must have been about like 2008 or so. I was going to visit some friends of mine in Toronto, and I lived way out in the West End, so if I wanted to go out and visit friends for an evening, I'd have to find a sofa to crash on, or a friend who had a spare bed or some spare room or something. And these friends were all, back then, they were all still single. And there were a bunch of Scottish and Irish guys I knew from a small town called St. Thomas, Ontario, which is a curious town, because it's a small town, and it produced one of the best hockey players of the last 30 years, Joe Thornton, who was the captain of the Boston Bruins. And this small town of 30,000 people, about 2.5 hours away from Toronto, also produced the actor Ryan Gosling. And then about 45 minutes from this little town, in another little town called Stratford, which also is about 40,000 people, that's where Justin Bieber came from. So it was an interesting area. But I had these friends, and I would go in and hang out with them once in a while. And they went to this, we always went to this dive bar in downtown Toronto, and it was owned by this Chinese dude. Now, my Scottish and Irish friends, they were heavy drinkers, and I didn't drink. And so, my whole life growing up, I've always, ever since I started my meditation routine and everything, I've always kind of lived differently than most people. So how do you have a normal social life when you don't do any of the normal social things that people do? Most times people like me, what they would do is their social life would be in a church or something. But by this time in 2008, I didn't belong to any religious organization, but I led a very disciplined life, and I meditated every day, and I was keeping up my writing and all of these things. Very odd guy. And I'd also by this time become a little bit famous because my novel published in 2007. So we go to this dive bar, and it's owned by this Chinese guy in his late 30s called Henry. And my buddies go, Henry, this is our friend Bruce. He's from Mississauga, the west end of Toronto. He speaks Mandarin. And Henry raises his eyebrows, and he speaks to me in Mandarin, and I speak back to him, and he comes over and shakes my hand, because Chinese people love it when you learn their language. And we start to talk, and we shift back to English, and I got like 4 or 5 friends lined up at the bar, and they're all listening to this conversation. And somehow the conversation gets into Taoism. And I just start like talking, and, quoting the 4 pillars of Taoism. I spoke for about 2 minutes, and Henry, he's just like in a trance. He doesn't say anything for 15 seconds. And then he just looks at my 4 or 5 friends drinking. And he says, oh, this is a very sacred conversation, not to be had in a bar, but you are a very wise man. He just could not believe that an outsider had penetrated Taoism, But you can penetrate anything if you meditate, right? So there's my anecdote about how difficult it is for outsiders. And another one that, a few of you have mentioned, Professor Jiang to me now, Jiang. And I've been watching him too. And he's teaching like an advanced high school class in English. I think it's in Beijing. But he was raised in Canada and went to Yale University in the United States, and then went back to China. And he's doing lectures in his history and social theory class in Beijing on blood sacrifice in Israeli culture, and explaining to his students that what's going on in Palestine is not war, it's not genocide, it is in fact blood sacrifice. And those of you who've reached out to me, like Jamie and Santo, who've seen this guy, it's like, holy shit, like, how did this guy figure this out? Right? Because it's always harder if you're coming from outside the culture. Okay? And for the secret society stuff, you really can't figure it out. You have to be told by an insider because it's just too esoteric, which means knowledge by initiation only. So Professor Hamamoto, very, very interesting guy. And my friend and friend of the podcast, Christine, sent me a video where he was talking about the Santa Fe Institute, where my favorite writer, Cormac McCarthy, lived for the last 20 years of his life. And it was remarkably, the Santa Fe Institute accepted a lot of money from Jeffrey Epstein. And this is another weird thing about Epstein, is he's always around these super brainy people, right? Like, it's almost like he's like an extraterrestrial spy or something, you know? And the question comes up, and probably there are underground tunnels from the Santa Fe Institute to Jeffrey Epstein's ranch there, because he had a ranch in New Mexico. In fact, let's look that up. So I'll ask Gemini, as I always do. Where was Jeffrey Epstein's ranch in New Mexico? This is interesting. Now, this is really hard for me too, right? Because Cormac McCarthy is my favorite writer, and I really don't want to believe he's mixed up in... So it's located near Stanley, New Mexico, approximately 30 miles southwest of Santa Fe in Santa Fe County. How far is the Santa Fe Institute from Stanley, New Mexico? Yeah, but these guys can tunnel for miles, right? There was a tunnel from Jack Nicholson's house to the Playboy Mansion. Did you know that? So 43 to 50 miles by car. It's about 50 minutes away. Anyways, there's just all these weird things coming out now, And it made me think about sex, which is an uncomfortable topic in many ways to talk about, even though it's epidemic in our society now. It's everywhere. But to have an open, honest, and frank conversation about sex is extremely difficult. Don't you think? I mean, it's easier to do it than it is to talk about it. So we now have to contemplate the reality that these top mathematicians and physicists, who were living at and Santa Fe Institute, you live at it. Okay, it's like a genius kibbutz is what it is. And they were financed through the roof, millions of dollars. It's like the ultimate kind of off the grid, I don't mean that literally, but off the grid think tank. And Cormac McCarthy was, to the best of my knowledge, the only artistic figure there, right? A literary figure. Although Cormac is remarkably well-read in physics. Like, it's one of his favorite topics to talk about. And it factors greatly into his last two books, because The Passenger and Stella Maris are the story of a brother and sister who had an incestuous relationship, and they were the son and daughter of one of the people on the Manhattan Project who made the bombs. And so the whole story takes place under the mushroom cloud, exactly like I was trying to explain in my Split podcast, which I haven't been able to do. And what I meant to say was I had not yet read The Passenger. And like a week before I do it, I do this Split podcast, and the themes in the podcast are eerily similar to the themes in the novel. And again, I highly recommend the novel. But this whole situation that Professor Hamamoto brings up, and I have to say, I've had my questions about Cormac for some time now. Even something as innocuous as doing the Oprah interview. Oprah's an insider. You don't get your book pushed by Oprah unless the cabal has some plan for you. Okay? Now, Cormac McCarthy is beyond a doubt one of the best storytellers who's lived in the last 200 years. His talent is through the roof. But he's godless. Okay? I have to admit that he's a godless man. And he admits this in his own novels. All his characters are always looking for God. You know, if you've seen the movie No Country for Old Men, and you know the Sheriff Bell character, there's a classic instance of it. I'll get it now and play it for you.
And back.
How'd you know I was here?
Who else would be driving up in your truck?
You heard it?
How's that?
Did you hear my... You're having fun with me.
What give you that idea? I seen one of the cats hurt it.
How'd you know it was my truck?
I deduced it when you walked in.
How many of them things you got now?
Cats? Oh, I don't know, several. Well, it depends on what you mean by God. Some of them are half wild, some of them are just outlaws.
How you been, Ellis?
You're looking at it. I got to say, you're looking older.
I am older.
Got a letter from your wife. She writes me pretty regular. Keeps me up on the family news.
Didn't know there was any.
Told me you're quitting.
You want a cup?
Appreciate it.
How fresh is that coffee?
I generally make a fresh pot every week, even if there's some left over.
That man that shot you died in prison?
Angola. Yeah.
What'd you done? He'd have been released.
Oh, I don't know. Nothing. Wouldn't be no point in it.
Kinda surprised to hear you say that.
Well, all the time you spend trying to get back what's been took from you, more is going out the door. After a while, you just have to try to get a tourniquet on it. Your granddad never asked me to sign on as a deputy. Loretta tells me you're quitting. How come you're doing that?
I don't know. I feel overmatched. I always figured when I got older, God would sort of come into my life somehow. He didn't. blame him. If I was him, I'd have the same opinion of me that he does.
You don't know what he thinks. I sent Uncle Mac's thumbbuster and badge over to the Rangers, put it in their museum. Did Daddy ever tell you how Uncle Mac come to his reward? Gunned down on his own porch over in Hudspeth County. 7 or 8 of them come up there, all wanting this, wanting that. Uncle Mac went back in the house to get the shotgun. Well, there's ahead of him. Shot him in his doorway. Aunt Ella come out and tried to stop the bleeding. Uncle Mac all the while trying to get that shotgun. They just sat there on their horses, watching him die. After a while, one of them said something in Indian, and they turned and left out. Uncle Mac knew the score, even if Aunt Ella didn't. Shot through the left lung. And that was that, as they say.
When did he die?
1909.
No, I mean, was it right away or in the night, or when was it?
I believe it was that night. She buried him the next morning, digging in that hard old caliche. What you got ain't nothing new. This country's hard on people. You can't stop what's coming. It ain't all waiting on you. That's vanity.
So there you go. That's classic Cormac right there, okay? Why have I lost my volume again? I might have to get myself some kind of soundboard or something to plug into this Mac, but I don't think I'm that professional yet, and you know what I'm saying. So that little exchange, you know, when I thought when I got older, God would come into my life, but he didn't. You would think that nothing of that if that's the only exposure to Cormac McCarthy you had. But it comes up in almost all his books. You know, Blood Meridian has got to be the most godless book ever written. You know, but in a sense not. But I'll leave, that's a whole other podcast. But the Border Trilogy, it's all about, you know, looking for God and meaning in life. And meanwhile, the characters are meeting horrible fates. You know, so, I mean, McCarthy was godless, which is the only downfall of his writing. Okay? Now, that doesn't mean that I'm suggesting that people go out and write deliberately religious or spiritual stories. But you can express the divine in a really fine piece of literature without sounding preachy. I think I managed to do it quite well in God as an Economist. And so that's the thing about McCarthy. And, you know, you got all these top mathematicians and physicists at the Santa Fe Institute. And now I have this creepy thought about all of them, these ugly older men going to get their balls tickled by 18, 19-year-old girls at Jeffrey's Ranch. And I got to admit, I kind of lose respect for people who do that. Okay? I just do. And it makes me wonder if men can be counted on anymore for anything. You know, have we always been this way? I noticed that when HBO hit its programming stride, beginning with The Sopranos, and then Oz, and Deadwood in particular, 1878 in a town called Deadwood, Montana. And there's always these whores and whore houses, and I'm wondering, have men always been this way? And why are we so weak in the flesh? And I forgive me for saying this, especially my male listeners, but when I contemplate topics like this, I actually kind of, for a brief moment, understand even third wave feminism and male hating lesbianism. If the intent of the lesbian is to have real human intimacy and connection, physically and emotionally, with another human being, and they don't believe they can achieve it with a man. And I'm wondering, what happened to us? How did we get this way? Well, first of all, we have to talk about the biological impulse in men and the strength of it. Like, I'll just say this off the top of my head. If you think I'm being flippant or I'm exaggerating, that's your business. But most successful artists are sex addicts. Sex is, in fact, the promise of congratulatory sex is a big part of why they survive the rigors of the artistic process and the loneliness of it. Vincent van Gogh used to go, he was so dedicated to his painting, he never took a wife or even a girlfriend. But he would go to a brothel twice a month, every 2 weeks. And so throughout history, we've always had whores. And I don't know if this whole Christian thing is just, putting a fresh coat of paint on rotten wood and pretending we're civilized and we care about our kids and our family. And I mean, you can be a lech and still love your kids. I'm not saying that every man who's a whoremonger doesn't actually love their kids. But this is what I am saying. They certainly don't want their daughter to grow up to be like the women they're using. And so you're kind of breaking the rule of universal compassion, right? Now, I will confess to you that I'm something of an expert on this. And it has to do with leaving home at 16 and not really settling down till I was about 30. And that was with my son's mother. But from 16 to then, from 16 to 26, so for a full decade, I lived in rooming houses, and I lived in, rundown hotels. There's a gecko there. It just made me jump. Like, not rundown hotels, but like monthly hotels, which is like one of the cheapest forms of living. I did that mostly through my all-university, too. I lived in monthly hotels. I had become so accustomed to that level of living, and I had become so accustomed to street people that I was very comfortable living in that environment. Now, when you live in an environment like that, there's gratuitous sex around you all the time. If you're living across the hall from a whore, should I watch my language here? I don't know. Let's just stick with that word. Okay, you're living across the hall from a prostitute. And, if you're living in one of these hotels and there's 14 rooms on one floor, and these are like 4-story hotels built in the 20s and 30s, the old welfare hotel, the by-the-month hotel. Who wants to run a by-the-month hotel? They don't do that in any of the major chains like Days Inn or anything like that. Motel 6. I mean, you might be able to get a weekly rate, but these hotels are specifically geared for people who wouldn't have the references to get into a nicer place. So basically, you're dealing with old and abandoned people, and they're generally old and abandoned because they've been miserable fuckers their whole life and probably alcoholics and burned all their bridges. You're dealing with prostitutes. You're dealing with people who are cycling out of halfway houses, because if you're coming out of prison on a major charge, they're not just going to let you walk out. These are charges with, 10 years or more, manslaughter and stuff like that. You don't just walk out of prison and go back to society. There's a transitory period where you have to live in on a parole or in a halfway house or something like that. And then when these guys are done that, they end up in the monthly hotels. So ex-cons, prostitutes, abandoned old people, and there I am living this life for 10 years. And I mean, you could have 3 or 4 whores on your floor. So for those of you who know Canada, I lived in the Gladstone Hotel before it was renovated in Toronto. Features prominently in God as an Economist. And then when I lived in Vancouver, before I went to Taiwan, I lived in the Cecil Hotel and the Marble Arch Hotel. And the Marble Arch Hotel was a strip joint, but it was the cheapest place in Vancouver to live. And you would meet all of these people. And for those of you who've read God as an Economist, this is how I was able to capture that level of life so accurately, the street life. So anyways, sex was very easy for me. And like no commitment, no nothing. I mean, you could befriend a couple whores on your floor. Hey, Sally, how you doing? Hey, Bruce. Still working on that. They used to make fun of me because they'd hear the click-clack of a manual typewriter coming from my room. When I lived in Vancouver, I used to have these two whores in their 30s, and they were both heroin addicts. They used to mainline right into their jugular in my room. And then they would get high on heroin, and they would sit and read the 4 to 8 pages I had typed in the last 3 or 4 days and tell me what they thought about it. Now, I never had sex with them. I never got a blowjob, nothing. They were just, the needles really scared me, but I had tremendous compassion for them. But other girls in that milieu, hey, you got an extra cigarette, Bruce? Yeah, I do. You want a blowjob? Okay. This was my life at 20 years old. So I'm meditating, I'm reading scripture, I'm writing books, I'm getting a journalism degree, but at the same time, I'm living this very, very lowest level of society life and just soaking it all in. So long story short, as a result of my youth, I have an immunity to sexual blackmail and temptation. It's not part of me anymore because but you think about these guys like the physicists and all this and all the people that an Epstein could rope in. They've probably had these fantasies, because there's so much sex in our society. It's in, pornography to begin with. It's in our television. It's in our advertising. It's in our music. It's in everywhere. It would almost be impossible for a man not to have sexual fantasies in 2025. Okay? So along comes a guy like Jeffrey Epstein, and he's the fantasy to reality guy. And I'll bet you a lot of those men who went down that road with him really regretted it. Because as you grow older and you can't do it anymore. You just realize these women are really banged up, and you can't do it. But to learn that lesson at 21 or 22 would be, for me, much better than learning it at 45 or 55 or 65, right? And then there's a whole other dimension to sex. It gets very esoteric, okay? People who are reptilian seeded, meaning that they have they have a hybridized consciousness. They're born human, but a reptilian, usually a Draco reptilian, is inserted into their consciousness at a very young age. And this is done to a surprising number of people. It would amaze you. Now, to keep the reptilian grounded in the body as you grow through the decades, you have to have sex all the time, and certain kinds of sex. Okay, very violent sex, very domineering and controlling sex. So, and a lot of artists, again, as I said, are sex addicts. You go through all the poets. Walt Whitman was gay, which is, if you don't get married, I think sex addiction and homosexuality are like first cousins. Okay, and I'm not trying to offend anybody. Okay, I'm not standing on a soapbox here. I've already told you about what my youth was like. Right? I hung around with befriended whores. You know that old expression, friends with benefits? That's the staple in a whore's life. Hey, Bruce, you got $10? No, Sally, I don't have $10 to lend you. I'll give you a blowjob. Okay. I mean, it's just the way it is. And, but when you get into the darker aspects of it and how prevalent it is now, there's something much darker to it. And the more you get used to abnormal sex, and Henry Miller said this, the harder it is to go back to normal sex and to be able to make love. Okay? It's very difficult for people with high levels of trauma to make love. They can fuck. They can do all kinds of crazy sex shit, and a lot of highly traumatized people get into crazy sex shit because that's the only way they can have sex, because the masquerade of fetishism prevents intimacy, and they're terrified of intimacy. And it's epidemic now. Epidemic. Everywhere you look. I think most of us would be very surprised how deep these circles go, these sex cult circles. I've heard, and I'm not trying to blaspheme anything here, but I've heard they even go into Tibetan culture. Okay? Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But I think one thing that we can all agree on is that when it reaches the level of children, something is seriously wrong. That's like, but how did we get to this point? Well, children, and violating children is the ultimate form of control-based sex. Violent, control-based sex. It's very, the rape of something that innocent, someone that innocent, a boy or a girl, is the high watermark of domination. And sex that begins fetishistically and within the domain of domination, because intimacy is too frightening, will eventually migrate to that. And then there's a whole esoteric dimension to that as well, in that you can rob certain energies from a child through the act of sex. You can rob part of what would be their base prana energy or their base chi energy, their kundalini energy. Okay, so there's a whole ritualistic dimension to it as well. I can tell you that where I'm at now in life, the most important thing for me now is to love people and to love my wife. And sex is secondary. My libido is not as strong as my wife's, you know. But I love my wife, and I love taking care of her, and I love taking care of my family, minus that fuckhead Steven. But that's a whole other story. He's going to change. It'll get through to him. And it's when you start feeling this utility of being of service that I look back at my life and I go, holy shit, why did it take me so long to figure this out? And I even had problems up here for a while. Like the old Bruce would come back and go, this isn't love. You should just go and, No, man. And then Spirit would come in and say, no, this is where you belong. Now keep in mind, as I went through this whole life, I kept up a very deep and focused internal life. Begging the question, is there a connection between spirituality and morality? And I have to report, based on my own experience in life, not really. I know a lot of people aren't going to like to hear that, but morality is important for maintaining a society. And if you like the comforts of a society, then you have to practice morality in your business dealings, in your investing, in your fidelity to family and children. You have to practice morality. Now, the encroaching spirituality we're getting now in the form of all these fucking flakes everywhere now, your Akashic record readers and, you look at that UFO crowd. Okay, and that whole Gaia crowd, when they have one of these like New World conventions and Carrie Cassidy goes and all these people go, all those dudes are fucking groupies. Again, you get this predatory, I'm special, I deserve recreational sex. I deserve porn star sex. I'm so-and-so. I'm not going to name any names, but when you spend as much time around a guy like John Edmonds as I did, up until he died, you hear some stories. John was also a man who came to understand the necessity of morality in life. So, if we're going to have a society with any kind of security and confidence, we're going to have to create a new kind of leader. I'm pretty sure Prime Minister Modi in India doesn't have a harem of chicks that are 18 years old that he fucks. Seriously doubt it. Pretty sure Netanyahu does. I think Netanyahu would be more into the boys. There's a whole sex culture between depraved Israelis fucking prepubescent Palestinian boys, too. There have been documentary films made about it. You've seen my podcasts on, I think the best one I did on sex and power is the Catamite Parade. It just gets worse and worse the higher you go up the power structure. Okay? This guy in Canada now, Mark Carney, He's going to the satanic sex and sacrifice parties. I'm like 95% sure. Okay? He's like a fully indoctrinated Satanist. He's been around the royal family in Britain. And they're reptilian hybrids, by the way. And throughout all of this is this sex thing. Okay? And this is the one thing we've allowed to permeate into our society, And then I've used this expression before on the Talamanca Review, but if you're the father of a daughter, you have to seriously ask yourself, Would you rather your daughter ended up in a burqa or on OnlyFans or doing tricks on the street or working for an escort agency? I think 9 out of 10 men, or 10 out of 10 men would say they would want their daughter in a burqa if only one of the two options existed. Now, a lot of the third and fourth wave feminists, the Chelsea Handler feminists, the Chelsea Clinton feminists would say, oh, it's very empowering for a woman to make money off of her body. You know, some of these OnlyFans models can make $3, $4, $5, $6, $7 million in a year. They're really, if they get a good money manager, they're set for life. But they're also at the same time ruined for life. And I don't mean to go all Muslim here. But no man wants to marry a woman like that. It is the absolute hypocrisy of we males. Everybody wants a Friday night with a whore, knowing they're damaging that woman and making her prospects of finding a long-term relationship less likely. And yet it's just in us. We do it. There's this predatory nature to the male sexuality. And then you get the women who sort of accept it and say, okay, this is the way the world works. And these next level women learn how to prey on the men economically. You know, the whole mistress game, the sugar daddy game, the whole thing. Right? And then the public-facing figures who aren't outright whoremongers, look at their women. Look at Jeff Bezos' wife. Look at a picture of her from 15 years ago and look at her now, and you swear to God she's morphed into a demon. What the fuck is he doing to her? What the fuck does he expect from her? It's a wacky world, man. But to consider my favorite writer whose infinite compassion and sensitivity to his characters in his books has consistently moved me for the last 30 years, maybe a confederate of the Jeffrey Epstein sex parties, is extremely disturbing to me. And then all these it's not just the politicians. It's fucking everywhere, man. Everywhere. Fucking sex freaks everywhere. And then ultimately, and this is one thing that I think Freud did get right, because remember, Freud interpreted consciousness through biology for the most part. There's nothing mystical about Freud, at least nothing he shared in his psychological theories, because those Kabbalists like to play their cards pretty close to their chest, don't give any of the deeper truths to the goy. Do you know under Noahide law, a Gentile can be put to death if they're found studying the Torah? You fucking heard it here first. So, yeah, this is my impromptu podcast tonight. These are the things that were just kind of on my mind. And again, I'm going to get the usual comments. Oh, Bruce, this is so personal. I can't believe you do podcasts this personal. There's nothing to be ashamed of. There's in our lives, there's nothing to be ashamed of. As long as you still want the grace of our Creator, the presence of the Creator in your heart and in your consciousness. And morality is a bunch of bullshit. You're allowed to learn your lessons and move toward correct living through knowledge rather than belief. Not that you need to reinvent the wheel 100 times over and make every mistake in life, But this is just the way my life worked out. Or my access to easy sex growing up on the streets. I should clarify something here because I don't want to leave this hanging. I mean Monica Lewinsky, Bill Clinton type sex. Never, ever, ever. And if there's any young male listeners I have, never, ever, ever put your penis inside a prostitute. It's bad for your health. It's bad for your astral body because they have all kinds of attachments. Just don't do it. So, I don't want to be too graphic, but you know what I'm saying, right? And then in Asia, holy shit, I had so many girlfriends in Taiwan, it wasn't funny. So the whole self-exploitation through sex, I've done all that. So if I were to become a famous writer at 62 years old, I finally take off and sell 100,000 books, there would be nothing that would move me. I would never end up in a Jeffrey Epstein circle or anything like that. Very weird. And women are weird too. Women are fucking weird too. For men, it's all tits and ass. And for women, it's all status. I fucked that guy. I let that guy fuck me. And if that guy has status, the woman carries the status. When I used to do book readings, I went on a little bit of a book tour with my first book. And I went to some authors festivals. And you would get put up at a nice 4.5, 5-star hotel. It's quite nice, actually. The literary life was quite nice. And then after your public reading, you would sit at a desk and sign books. And you'd get napkins with room numbers. And beautiful women who would never fuck me if I didn't stand on a stage and read from a book. So women are just as bad as men. It's just a different criteria. And I think I'm going to call this podcast Learning to Love the Hard Way. I'm Bruce McDonald, and this has been the Telemanca Review.